It usually begins without intention. A single video appears in your recommendations. A podcast episode autoplays while you're driving. A headline catches your eye at exactly the wrong moment. A woman vanishes without a trace. A crime unfolds in a place that looks eerily familiar. You tell yourself you'll listen for 5 minutes. Just enough to understand what happened. Just enough to satisfy curiosity. But 5 minutes becomes an hour, and the hour disappears entirely. Somewhere between the opening hook and the closing credits, you stop asking why you clicked and start wondering why you can't stop. What is it about true crime that pulls us in so quietly, so convincingly? Why do stories rooted in real suffering feel almost magnetic? Is it morbid curiosity, or something deeper, something older, wired into us long before podcasts and streaming platforms existed? Human beings have always been drawn to danger from a safe distance. Long before microphones and cameras, people gathered around fires to hear stories about betrayal, violence, and survival. These were not told for entertainment alone, they were warnings. Lessons disguised as narratives. True crime feels like a modern continuation of that instinct. When we hear about a crime, our minds don't just absorb the details, we run simulations. How did this happen? What signs were missed? Would I have noticed? Could this happen to me? In asking these questions, we're not chasing fear for its own sake, we're searching for protection. Or at least, the illusion of it. That illusion matters. True crime allows us to experience fear without risk. The doors are locked. The killer is already gone. The danger is neatly contained within a timeline, narrated calmly, edited carefully, and delivered at our convenience. Our bodies react anyway. Adrenaline rises. Dopamine follows curiosity. Relief arrives when answers appear. Neurologically, it mirrors the structure of a thriller, except this time, it's real. And that is where the ethical tension quietly begins. Because someone else's worst day has become part of our nightly routine. We rarely acknowledge how much structure shapes these stories. Real trauma is chaotic, messy, unresolved. But true crime smooths the edges. It gives us beginnings and endings, suspects and motives, arcs that feel satisfying even when the truth is anything but. In a world that often feels unpredictable, these stories offer order. They make chaos feel understandable. But understanding is not the same as truth, and control is not the same as safety. How often do we mistake narrative clarity for moral clarity? Most people who consume true crime insist on one thing: they care about the victims. And often they do. But caring becomes complicated when it's repeated, replayed, and consumed in bulk. Over time, empathy can dull, not out of cruelty, but out of adaptation. The first story shocks you. The 10th unsettles you. The 100th becomes background noise. This is desensitization, and it doesn't announce itself. It creeps in quietly, until suffering feels familiar and tragedy becomes content you half listen to while scrolling your phone. There's also distance, emotional and geographical, that makes true crime easier to consume. The victims are usually strangers. The crimes happen somewhere else. That distance creates comfort, but it also creates detachment. It's easier to analyze a story when you don't have to sit with the aftermath. Easier to debate theories, to speculate, to comment. Online, these stories don't just end, they multiply. Comment sections become courtrooms. Algorithms reward the most engaging version of the truth, not the most compassionate one. And slowly, the story shifts. It stops being about what happened and starts being about how well it performs. The internet has removed one thing tragedy used to rely on: time. In the past, stories faded. Today, they are archived forever. A case from 20 years ago can resurface overnight, packaged for a new audience that never lived through it the first time. For viewers, this feels like discovery. For families, it can feel like reopening a wound that never fully healed. Imagine searching your loved one's name and finding their death dissected by strangers who speak with certainty about moments they never lived. At what point does remembrance become repetition, and repetition become harm? Many justify their interest in true crime by framing it as advocacy. Awareness keeps cases alive. Attention leads to justice. Sometimes, this is undeniably true. But awareness has a way of shifting into something quieter and more self-serving: closure. We want answers. We want endings. We want a sense that the world still makes sense if we just understand it deeply enough. When stories don't give us that closure, we don't walk away, we consume more. More theories. More episodes. More speculation. We chase resolution not for the victims, but for ourselves. True crime, at its core, is a mirror. It reflects our fears, our curiosity, our desire for meaning in chaos. It shows us how easily empathy can coexist with consumption, how quickly education can blur into entertainment. The problem isn't that we're drawn to these stories. The problem is that we rarely stop to ask what that draw is doing to us, and to the people whose lives have become narratives we revisit for comfort, curiosity, or distraction. This first part is not an accusation. It's an invitation. An invitation to notice the pull before judging it. To recognize that the reason we can't look away is deeply human. But humanity, left unexamined, has a way of crossing lines without realizing it ever stepped over them. And if we don't understand why we're watching, how can we possibly understand the cost? In the next part, that cost becomes clearer, when awareness begins to compete with entertainment, and storytelling starts to reward spectacle over truth. That is where the ethical gray stops being theoretical and starts becoming personal. When awareness becomes entertainment. How good intentions quietly turn into spectacle. Most true crime stories don't begin as entertainment. They begin as warnings, as pleas for attention, as unfinished stories begging to be understood. At least, that's how we like to frame them. We tell ourselves we're here to learn, to stay informed, to remember the victims. But somewhere along the way, the purpose shifts. The tone changes. The music swells. The cliffhanger appears. And without anyone announcing it, awareness starts to compete with entertainment. When does that shift happen? Is it the moment a tragic story is edited for suspense? The moment an ad break interrupts a victim's final moments? Or is it the moment we find ourselves thinking, this would make a great series? True crime rarely announces when it crosses the line. It drifts. At first, the storytelling feels respectful. The narrator speaks calmly. The facts are laid out carefully. There is a sense of seriousness, even reverence. But as episodes stack and audiences grow, something subtle changes. Details are framed to shock. Timelines are rearranged for tension. Speculation creeps in, dressed up as analysis. The goal is no longer just to inform, it's to hold attention. And attention, in the modern media landscape, is currency. This is where intention and outcome begin to diverge. A creator may genuinely want to raise awareness, but platforms reward engagement, not ethics. Algorithms don't care about context or trauma. They care about watch time, clicks, and emotional reactions. The more disturbing or mysterious a story feels, the more likely it is to spread. The more it spreads, the more it gets remixed, reinterpreted, and re-uploaded. Slowly, the original purpose dissolves beneath layers of performance. And we, as viewers, play a role in that transformation. Consider how often true crime content is consumed passively. It plays while we cook, clean, commute, or scroll. Real deaths become background noise. Real suffering fills silence. We may still feel sympathy, but it's diluted, stretched thin across dozens of cases, hundreds of hours. The more familiar the format becomes, the less weight each story carries. Tragedy turns into genre. And genres come with expectations. We expect twists. We expect reveals. We expect emotional payoff. But real life doesn't owe us any of those things. When a case doesn't resolve cleanly, audiences grow frustrated. Comment sections fill with theories. Speculation accelerates. Someone must be guilty. Someone must make it make sense. In this space, misinformation doesn't just spread, it thrives. And once speculation is framed as entertainment, the consequences feel abstract. After all, it's just a story. Except it isn't. It's someone's life. Someone's family. Someone's unfinished grief. One of the clearest signs that awareness has turned into entertainment is tone. The same case can be presented in radically different ways, somber and restrained, or dramatic and sensational. Music choices, pacing, thumbnails, and titles all shape how a story is received. A tragic death becomes a chilling mystery. A victim becomes the girl who vanished. Language strips away individuality and replaces it with intrigue. We rarely question this because it works. Engagement spikes. Views climb. The story reaches more people. And in a results-driven culture, reach is often treated as justification. If more people are watching, then surely more good is being done. But visibility without care can be harmful. Awareness that prioritizes emotion over accuracy doesn't enlighten, it distorts. The hardest part is that this shift often happens with the audience's blessing. We click the most dramatic title. We share the most shocking clip. We reward the content that makes us feel something immediately, even if that feeling is discomfort. Over time, creators learn what works. Not consciously, not maliciously, but strategically. The algorithm teaches them how to tell stories that survive. And survival, in this space, often means escalation. What happens when awareness isn't enough anymore? When facts alone don't hold attention? The answer is embellishment. Longer runtimes. Bigger claims. Sharper hooks. Each iteration pushing the boundary a little further than the last. Until the story becomes less about justice and more about retention. There's a moment many viewers recognize but rarely articulate. The moment you realize you're enjoying the story. Not appreciating the information. Not empathizing with the victims. Enjoying it. That realization can feel uncomfortable, even shameful. So we rationalize it. We tell ourselves the enjoyment comes from learning, from understanding psychology, from being informed. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes, enjoyment is just enjoyment. True crime becomes especially dangerous when it creates emotional distance under the guise of seriousness. Unlike fictional horror, it wears the costume of responsibility. It feels justified. That makes it easier to consume without reflection. Easier to forget that real people didn't choose to be part of this narrative. Easier to ignore that their stories are being retold in ways they can't control. This doesn't mean true crime should stop existing. It means it should be interrogated. Because once awareness becomes entertainment, the priorities shift. The audience's comfort begins to matter more than the subject's dignity. The story becomes optimized for consumption, not understanding. And the ethical gray grows darker, not because of one bad actor, but because of a system that rewards attention above all else. So the question isn't whether true crime educates or exploits. The question is, who benefits most from the way the story is told? If the primary outcome is engagement, revenue, and personal brand growth, then awareness has already taken a backseat. And once entertainment becomes the dominant force, pulling back becomes almost impossible. In the next part, the consequences of this shift become painfully clear, when victims are no longer at the center of their own stories, and the people who suffered the most become footnotes in narratives built around mystery, villains, and spectacle. That is where the ethical gray turns personal. And where silence starts to feel like complicity. Victims in the background. How the most important people become the least remembered. There is a moment in many true crime stories when the victim quietly disappears, not from the case, but from the focus. Their name is mentioned less. Their life is reduced to a handful of traits. Their personality becomes a paragraph, then a sentence, then a photograph on the screen while the narrative moves on to more interesting elements. Suspects, theories, timelines, motives. The story doesn't mean to forget them. It just slowly stops looking at them. How often do we truly remember who the victim was before the crime? Not how they died. Not the moment they were last seen. Not the mistakes people claim they made. But who they were on an ordinary day. What made them laugh. What they were proud of. What kind of future they imagined for themselves. True crime rarely lingers there. Ordinary life doesn't perform well. From the very beginning, many cases are framed around mystery rather than humanity. Victims become entry points, not centers. They are introduced so the story can begin, then gradually replaced by the puzzle itself. The disappearance matters more than the person who disappeared. The crime matters more than the life interrupted. And in that transition, something deeply ethical slips through our fingers. It's easier to talk about a case than a person. Cases can be analyzed. People require empathy. This is where distance becomes dangerous. When a victim is reduced to a role, the missing woman, the murdered student, the child at the center of the case, they stop being fully human in the public imagination. Labels flatten complexity. They turn lives into symbols and tragedies into templates that can be reused across dozens of similar stories. And the more familiar the template becomes, the less weight each individual story carries. There is a reason certain victims dominate true crime media while others are barely mentioned. Stories that fit familiar narratives, young, photogenic, middle class, from places audiences recognize, are more likely to go viral. This isn't accidental. It's structural. Algorithms reward relatability, and relatability often mirrors privilege. Entire communities disappear from the genre because their stories are deemed too common or too complex to capture attention. When that happens, true crime doesn't just reflect bias, it amplifies it. Even when victims are covered extensively, the focus often narrows to their final moments. Their lives are treated as context, their deaths as content. We learn where they were last seen, what they were wearing, who they spoke to. We replay surveillance footage. We analyze text messages. We dissect timelines with forensic precision. But rarely do we sit with the fullness of what was lost. Loss doesn't trend well. Mystery does. This imbalance affects families in ways audiences rarely consider. For loved ones, the victim never becomes a case. They remain a presence, missing, remembered, grieved. Watching that person be transformed into a storyline can feel like a second loss. One family member described it as, "Seeing my sister turned into a character other people feel entitled to rewrite." And entitlement is the right word. Once a story enters the true crime ecosystem, it no longer belongs to the people most affected by it. Strangers feel free to speculate about motives, behavior, and choices. Victims are scrutinized in ways they never consented to. Their past is mined for drama. Their mistakes, real or imagined, are amplified until they feel like explanations rather than context. Subtle victim blaming often slips in here, disguised as analysis. Why was she there? Why did he trust them? Why didn't they leave sooner? These questions are framed as logical inquiries, but they shift focus away from the harm done and onto the person harmed. The crime becomes something that happened because of the victim, not to them. And the more these questions circulate, the more normalized they become. Even well-meaning creators can fall into this trap. When content is produced at scale, nuance is often the first casualty. Context gets simplified. Complexity gets trimmed. The story must keep moving. But real people don't exist to support a narrative arc. There is also the issue of repetition. A victim's name might be spoken millions of times by people who never knew them, while the family hears it spoken less and less in everyday life. Online, the victim feels omnipresent. Offline, they feel painfully absent. That contrast can be devastating. And yet, the cycle continues. Because audiences don't feel the aftermath. We feel the story, then we move on. Another case loads. Another voice begins. Another life becomes content. True crime often claims to give victims a voice. But speaking about someone is not the same as speaking for them, and it is certainly not the same as listening. A voice without consent is not empowerment. It is interpretation. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the victim could see how their story is told, would they recognize themselves in it? Would they feel honored, or exposed? In many cases, victims are remembered only through the lens of violence. Their identity becomes inseparable from what happened to them. That kind of legacy is not neutral. It shapes how society remembers them, and how their families are allowed to grieve. Grief, after all, is not meant to be public property. And yet, in the true crime ecosystem, grief becomes searchable, commentable, shareable. None of this means victims should be erased in the name of sensitivity. Silence can be harmful too. But centering victims requires more than mentioning their names at the beginning of an episode. It requires resisting the urge to turn their suffering into spectacle. It requires slowing down when the algorithm demands speed. It requires asking whether the story would still be told if it weren't compelling. That is a hard question to sit with. Because if the answer is no, then the victim was never the point. In the next part, the ethical tension sharpens further, when tragedy becomes profitable, and storytelling begins to generate revenue. When ads play, sponsors appear, and suffering quietly turns into income. That is where the question stops being about attention and becomes about money. The monetization problem. When tragedy becomes a business model. There is a moment in many true crime videos that feels quietly jarring if you let yourself notice it. The narrator's voice slows. The details grow heavier. A life is being described at the point where it fractures forever. And then, without warning, the tone shifts. Music fades. An upbeat voice cuts in. A product is introduced. A discount code appears on screen. And just like that, someone's worst moment shares space with an advertisement. Most viewers barely register this transition anymore. It has become normal. Expected even. But normal does not mean neutral. It means we've adjusted. True crime does not exist in isolation. It lives inside platforms designed to make money. YouTube, Spotify, TikTok, these are not libraries or archives. They are businesses built on attention. And attention, once monetized, reshapes everything it touches, including grief. Most true crime creators do not begin with profit in mind. Many start with curiosity, empathy, or fascination with storytelling. They research cases late at night, speak carefully, frame their work as educational. In the beginning, money feels distant, irrelevant even. But as audiences grow, the environment changes. Production quality improves. Upload schedules tighten. View counts fluctuate. Sponsors reach out. And suddenly, storytelling is no longer just storytelling. It's sustainability. At that point, true crime becomes a job. Jobs require output. Output requires material. And material, in this genre, often means tragedy. This is where the ethical tension sharpens. When a creator's income depends on telling stories about harm, choosing not to tell one becomes a financial decision. Taking a break from tragedy becomes a risk. Saying, "This case doesn't feel right to cover," can mean saying no to growth, visibility, or stability. The system doesn't demand exploitation outright. It rewards consistency. And consistency in true crime usually means escalation. Audiences grow accustomed to a certain level of intensity. What once felt shocking becomes familiar. Creators feel pressure, sometimes conscious, often not, to maintain engagement. Thumbnails grow darker. Titles grow more dramatic. Pacing tightens. Details become sharper, more disturbing, more emotionally charged. Not because creators are cruel, but because platforms reward what holds attention. The algorithm does not distinguish between awareness and sensationalism. It measures reactions, watch time, click-through rates, comments, shares. If a video performs well, its methods are reinforced. If it underperforms, those methods are abandoned. Ethics are not part of this feedback loop. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in priorities. Cases are chosen not only for importance, but for potential performance. Stories with clear villains, shocking twists, or unresolved mysteries rise to the top. Complex cases that require nuance, or ones involving marginalized victims, are quietly passed over because they're perceived as not engaging enough. At that point, true crime stops reflecting reality and starts curating it. Monetization also changes pacing. Ads interrupt narratives at moments designed to keep viewers watching. Cliffhangers are strategically placed. Emotional peaks are extended. Trauma is edited for retention. None of this happens by accident. It happens because creators learn, through data, what keeps audiences from clicking away. And while each decision seems small on its own, together they reshape the moral center of the story. The presence of money introduces another uncomfortable question: who is benefiting from this story? The victims are not paid. Their families are not consulted. Their pain becomes a resource that others build careers on. Some creators donate proceeds or partner with advocacy groups, and that matters. But charity does not erase imbalance. Giving back does not automatically neutralize extraction. A system can do some good while still being ethically compromised. There is also the issue of scale. When one creator tells a story, the impact is limited. When hundreds of creators cover the same case, each adding their own monetized interpretation, the story becomes an ecosystem. Ads play millions of times. Revenue accumulates across platforms. And the suffering that made it possible remains unchanged. For families watching from the outside, this can feel deeply violating. Many have spoken about the shock of realizing how profitable their loved one's death has become. How strangers know intimate details. How theories circulate as facts. How speculation generates income while they carry the consequences offline. One family member described it as watching my grief turn into content I have no control over. That loss of control is central to the monetization problem. Once a story enters the content economy, it no longer belongs to the people it affects most. It belongs to whoever can package it most effectively. And effectiveness, in this context, is measured in views. This creates a paradox. The more ethically complex a case is, the harder it is to tell responsibly, and the less likely it is to perform well. Responsible storytelling is slower, quieter, more uncertain. It resists conclusions. It prioritizes context over shock. But slowness does not trend. So creators face a choice, whether they articulate it or not, lean into nuance and risk obscurity, or lean into spectacle and survive. Most don't consciously choose exploitation. They choose visibility. And visibility rewards compromise. Audiences are not innocent in this dynamic. We click. We binge. We reward content that disturbs us in compelling ways. We complain when videos feel boring. We equate emotional intensity with value. Over time, we train creators just as much as algorithms do. The monetization problem is not about bad people doing bad things. It's about a system that turns tragedy into a renewable resource, and then acts surprised when boundaries erode. Even the language of content reflects this shift. Cases are described as hot, viral, or trending. Stories are covered, revisited, rebranded. These terms are normal in media, but when applied to real suffering, they reveal how thoroughly pain has been absorbed into market logic. At a certain point, it becomes difficult to tell where awareness ends and exploitation begins, because both are generating the same outcomes. More views, more revenue, more demand. And demand, once established, does not ask whether the supply is ethical. It asks whether it's consistent. This doesn't mean true crime creators are inherently unethical. It means they operate inside an environment that rewards ethical shortcuts. And without intentional resistance, those shortcuts become standard practice. The most unsettling part is how easily this all becomes invisible. Ads fade into background noise. Sponsorships feel routine. Revenue feels abstract. We rarely connect the dots between someone's death and someone else's livelihood, even when they are directly linked. But they are linked. And once we see that link clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend the genre exists purely for education or justice. Money changes the relationship between storyteller, subject, and audience. It introduces incentives that have nothing to do with truth or care. The question is not whether monetization can coexist with ethics. The question is whether ethics can survive when monetization sets the pace. In the next part, this tension becomes even more personal, when the storyteller themselves becomes the brand, and the case is no longer the center of attention. When true crime stops being about what happened and starts being about who is telling it. That is where influence replaces information, and where the ethical gray grows even more complicated. The rise of the true crime influencer. When the story is no longer the center. There was a time when true crime felt faceless. A voice spoke, a story unfolded, and when it ended, the narrator disappeared. The focus, at least in theory, stayed on the case. Today, that distance has collapsed. True crime has faces now. Personalities. Brands. Loyal followings who don't just listen for the story, but for the storyteller. This shift did not happen overnight. It emerged gradually, shaped by platforms that reward visibility and familiarity. Algorithms favor creators people recognize, trust, and return to. Over time, the true crime creator stopped being a narrator and became a presence. A guide. Sometimes even a moral authority. And once that happens, the story is no longer alone in the spotlight. The rise of the true crime influencer has transformed how cases are told and received. Viewers tune in not just to learn what happened, but to hear how this creator feels about it. Their reactions. Their interpretations. Their judgments. The case becomes filtered through personality. And personality, by its nature, is subjective. This subjectivity is not inherently harmful. Storytelling has always involved perspective. But when a creator's voice becomes more influential than the facts themselves, the balance shifts. The narrative stops being about understanding the case, and starts being about aligning with the storyteller's worldview. This is where influence quietly turns into power. True crime influencers don't just inform, they shape opinion. Their audience trusts them, often deeply. They've listened to hours of their voice. They've followed their emotional responses. They've internalized their framing. When a creator expresses doubt about a suspect, suspicion spreads. When they express certainty, it solidifies. The audience follows, not because they've independently verified the facts, but because they feel connected. This connection is parasocial. It feels personal, even though it's one-sided. Viewers feel like they know the creator. They feel included, understood. And that sense of closeness makes the creator's opinions feel safer, more reliable. But safety can be misleading. When influence grows, accountability rarely grows at the same pace. Unlike journalists, many true crime influencers are not bound by editorial oversight, legal teams, or professional codes of ethics. Their authority comes from engagement, not credentials. And engagement rewards confidence, not caution. Saying, "I don't know," doesn't trend. Saying, "Here's what I think really happened," does. So speculation becomes analysis. Opinion becomes narrative. And once a narrative settles in an audience's mind, it's difficult to dislodge, especially when it's reinforced by a creator they trust. The influencer model also encourages emotional performance. Reactions are amplified. Shock is visible. Anger is expressed. Tears are sometimes shared. These moments feel authentic, and sometimes they are. But they also function as content. Emotion becomes part of the product. This creates a delicate ethical tension. When a creator cries on camera, is it empathy or engagement? When outrage is expressed, is it moral clarity or brand alignment? The audience may never know, and the creator may not either. But the system benefits either way. As the creator's brand grows, the case risks becoming secondary. Viewers come for the personality, not the people involved. The crime becomes a backdrop for commentary. A stage on which the influencer performs insight, morality, or outrage. In extreme cases, this leads to something even more troubling: the replacement of victims. The creator becomes the emotional center of the story. Their feelings matter most. Their reaction becomes the takeaway. The audience discusses the creator's perspective more than the victim's life. The story becomes less about what happened and more about how it was experienced by the influencer. This is not intentional cruelty. It's structural. Platforms reward faces, names, consistency. And over time, the influencer's identity becomes inseparable from the genre itself. There is also the issue of competition. True crime influencers operate in a crowded space. Cases overlap. Coverage races begin. Whoever posts first gains traction. Whoever frames it most compellingly wins attention. This speed discourages caution. Fact-checking slows things down. Waiting for confirmation risks being late. So creators move fast. Sometimes too fast. Mistakes happen. Names are mispronounced. Details are wrong. Context is missing. And when those errors spread to millions, the consequences are not theoretical. Real people are affected. Reputations are harmed. Misinformation hardens into belief. Yet corrections rarely perform as well as accusations. Apologies don't go viral. Accountability doesn't trend. And so the influencer economy keeps moving forward, rarely looking back. The most unsettling part is how normalized this has become. We expect creators to have takes. We expect them to speculate. We reward confidence over uncertainty. We forget that the people being discussed cannot log off, rebrand, or pivot. Their lives are not content strategies. This raises a difficult question. When a creator's career depends on telling other people's tragedies, where should the line be drawn? Should influence come with responsibility? Should popularity demand restraint? Should storytelling slow down when real lives are involved? The system does not require these questions to be answered. It rewards output, not reflection. And so the burden falls on individual creators and audiences to decide where they stand. But deciding requires awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable. Because if the true crime influencer is the product, then the story is no longer the point. In the next part, that shift becomes even darker, when audiences begin forming emotional relationships not just with creators, but with criminals themselves. When understanding turns into fascination, and fascination risks becoming admiration. That is where the ethical gray moves from troubling to dangerous, and where the line between analysis and obsession nearly disappears. Parasocial relationships with evil. Why we feel close to people who terrify us. There is something unsettling about how familiar certain criminals feel. Their names roll easily off the tongue. Their faces are instantly recognizable. Their voices, sometimes calm, sometimes chilling, linger in the mind long after the story ends. For people who have caused unimaginable harm, they occupy a surprising amount of mental space. We know their habits, their childhoods, their fears, their favorite phrases. In some cases, we know them better than we know the victims whose lives they destroyed. How did that happen? True crime rarely sets out to glorify evil, yet familiarity has a way of softening edges. The more we hear a story, the less shocking it becomes. The more details we absorb, the more human the subject feels. And humanity, once acknowledged, can slide into something far more complicated than understanding. Parasocial relationships are usually discussed in the context of celebrities and influencers, one-sided emotional bonds formed through repeated exposure. But true crime has created a darker version of this phenomenon. Audiences don't just form attachments to creators. They form attachments to criminals. Not admiration, necessarily. Not sympathy, at least not consciously. But a sense of knowing. Of closeness. Of curiosity that feels personal. We ask questions about perpetrators that we would never ask about victims. What were they like as children? What trauma shaped them? What music did they listen to? What were their last words? These questions are framed as psychological inquiry, but repetition changes their meaning. Over time, the criminal becomes a character. A subject of fascination. Someone whose inner world is explored with depth and persistence. Meanwhile, the victim remains defined by absence. This imbalance doesn't happen accidentally. Evil, when framed as mystery, performs well. It invites analysis. It promises insight into the darkest corners of human behavior. Audiences are drawn to explanations because explanations feel like control. If we can understand why someone committed violence, perhaps we can prevent it. Perhaps we can spot the signs. Perhaps we can protect ourselves. But understanding is not neutral. The more attention a perpetrator receives, the more cultural space they occupy. Their name becomes searchable. Their image circulates. Their legacy grows. And while most viewers would never consciously celebrate this, attention itself becomes a form of preservation. Infamy survives where memory fades. This creates a disturbing feedback loop. Crimes that are sensational receive more coverage. Coverage increases notoriety. Notoriety inspires fascination. Fascination generates more content. And the cycle continues, long after the legal case has closed. For some perpetrators, this attention becomes part of the harm they inflicted. Their violence echoes beyond the act itself, amplified by endless retellings. In extreme cases, this notoriety becomes aspirational, not for most viewers, but for a small, dangerous minority who crave recognition at any cost. True crime rarely acknowledges this risk, but it exists. Parasocial closeness also affects how audiences interpret responsibility. When we hear about a criminal's trauma repeatedly, we may begin to frame their actions as inevitable rather than chosen. Context quietly turns into explanation. Explanation drifts toward justification, not morally, but emotionally. We start saying things like, "It makes sense why they turned out this way." But making sense of something is not the same as excusing it. The danger lies in how empathy is distributed. When perpetrators receive psychological depth and narrative complexity, while victims remain symbols, the moral center of the story shifts. The crime becomes a case study. The harm becomes abstract. This shift doesn't require admiration. It only requires repetition. Another layer of this phenomenon appears in fan communities that form around notorious criminals. While most true crime audiences reject these extremes, they exist on the fringes, and sometimes not so far from the center. Online forums, comment sections, and social media spaces where perpetrators are discussed with disturbing intimacy. Nicknames are used. Aesthetic edits circulate. Quotes are shared. These spaces are often dismissed as outliers, but they are symptoms of a broader pattern. When exposure becomes familiarity, boundaries erode. Even outside of these extremes, language changes. Criminals are referred to by first names. Their intelligence is debated. Their charisma is analyzed. Their crimes become narratives rather than acts of violence. And language shapes perception. The more casually we speak about evil, the less weight it carries. Creators contribute to this dynamic, often unintentionally. Long-form analysis requires material, and perpetrators provide it. Their motives, psychology, and behavior offer endless angles. Victims, by contrast, are finite. Their lives are harder to reconstruct without speculation. Their absence limits narrative expansion. So the focus drifts, again, not out of malice, but out of convenience. The ethical problem emerges when this focus begins to overshadow harm. When understanding perpetrators becomes more compelling than honoring victims. When curiosity outweighs care. Audiences often defend this imbalance by arguing that understanding evil helps prevent it. And sometimes it does. But prevention requires responsibility. It requires context, boundaries, and restraint. Without those, fascination becomes consumption. And consumption does not ask moral questions. It asks what comes next. There is also the emotional safety that comes with focusing on perpetrators rather than victims. Victim stories demand grief. They demand loss. They demand empathy that hurts. Perpetrators, by contrast, offer distance. Analyzing evil feels safer than sitting with suffering. It allows us to intellectualize pain rather than feel it. In this way, parasocial closeness to criminals becomes a coping mechanism. A way to stay engaged without being overwhelmed. But coping mechanisms have consequences. When evil becomes familiar, it risks becoming ordinary. Not acceptable, but expected. And expectation dulls urgency. It turns horror into routine. Another case. Another killer. Another episode. At that point, the question is no longer why we're curious. It's why we're comfortable. True crime occupies a fragile ethical space because it asks audiences to look directly at violence without becoming consumed by it. Parasocial relationships with evil threaten that balance. They pull focus away from accountability and toward fascination. They transform perpetrators into enduring figures while victims fade into memory. This does not mean we should stop seeking understanding. It means we must examine what understanding becomes when it is monetized, serialized, and endlessly repeated. Because when evil feels familiar, something has already gone wrong. In the next part, that familiarity spills outward, beyond screens and podcasts, into real-world consequences. When audiences stop watching and start acting. When internet sleuths turn speculation into intervention, and curiosity becomes harm. That is where the ethical gray leaves the realm of storytelling and enters the lives of people who never asked to be part of the story at all. The problem is that action without accountability is not justice. True crime thrives on unresolved questions. The internet rushes to fill the gaps. But not all gaps are meant to be filled publicly. Not all questions deserve immediate answers. And not all curiosity should be acted upon. The ethical gray of true crime becomes darkest when viewers forget they are not neutral observers. Watching feels harmless. Commenting feels small. Sharing feels insignificant. But collectively, these actions shape real lives. The question is no longer whether internet sleuthing can help. It's whether we are willing to accept the harm it causes when it doesn't. In the next part, the focus shifts from people to systems, specifically, the algorithms that amplify speculation, reward outrage, and accelerate everything we've been examining. Because while individuals make choices, platforms shape behavior. And platforms, unlike people, do not feel guilt. They optimize. Grief is not designed for public forums. True crime often frames internet sleuthing as empowerment, but empowerment without responsibility becomes intrusion. The desire to help does not grant permission to harm. And the assumption that more eyes equal better outcomes ignores the complexity of real investigations. Law enforcement operates slowly for a reason. Caution is built into the process. Evidence must meet standards. Accusations require proof. Online spaces remove these safeguards in the name of speed and engagement. Speed feels productive. Caution feels boring. But boring is often ethical. The hardest truth about internet sleuthing is that most participants will never see the consequences of their actions. They will move on to the next case, the next theory, the next mystery. The people affected will not. Their names will remain linked to speculation. Their lives will continue under a shadow they did not choose. And yet, the cycle continues, because participation feels meaningful. It gives audiences a sense of agency in stories that otherwise feel distant. It transforms passive consumption into action. The ethical problem here is diffusion of responsibility. When harm is spread across thousands of people, no one feels accountable. Each participant believes their contribution is too small to matter. But together, those small contributions create overwhelming force. This is how crowds become dangerous. The internet also blurs the distinction between public interest and private life. Just because information is accessible does not mean it is ethical to share. But accessibility creates entitlement. If someone's social media is public, people assume it's fair game. If a record exists, it feels permissible to circulate it. This logic ignores context, consent, and consequence. Internet sleuths often justify their actions by claiming they are doing what law enforcement failed to do. Sometimes that frustration is understandable. Institutions do fail. Cases are mishandled. Voices are ignored. But replacing flawed systems with unregulated crowds does not fix injustice, it multiplies risk. Justice requires restraint. Crowds reward momentum. There is also a performative element to online investigation. Sleuthing becomes content. Threads gain followers. Accounts grow. People are praised for their insights. Recognition becomes a motivator. The search for truth quietly competes with the desire for visibility. And visibility changes behavior. The more attention a theory receives, the harder it becomes to abandon, even when evidence contradicts it. Admitting error feels like loss. Doubling down feels safer. And so misinformation persists, long after it has been disproven. The victims of this process are not just the wrongly accused. Families of victims are affected too. Watching strangers debate intimate details of their loved one's life can be deeply re-traumatizing. Seeing rumors spread as facts can reopen wounds that never fully healed. And knowing that these discussions happen without consent adds another layer of pain. Once a theory gains attention, it begins to self-reinforce. People search for information that supports it. Contradictions are dismissed. Doubt is framed as ignorance or complicity. The more people agree, the more true it feels. And the algorithm, watching this engagement spike, pushes it further. At that point, speculation is no longer speculation. It is a narrative. And narratives have power. There have been cases where innocent people were publicly accused, harassed, and threatened because online communities decided they fit. Their lives were dissected. Their past scrutinized. Their faces shared across platforms. Even when authorities cleared them, the damage remained. Search results don't forget. Screenshots don't expire. Being innocent does not undo being visible. The emotional toll of this kind of exposure is difficult to overstate. Imagine waking up to thousands of strangers debating your guilt. Imagine being reduced to a theory. Imagine knowing that no matter what you say, it will be filtered through suspicion. This is not justice. It is spectacle. And yet, the system that enables it remains intact. Platforms rarely intervene until harm becomes undeniable. Creators distance themselves by saying, "I never named anyone," even as their framing invites speculation. Audiences tell themselves they are just asking questions. But questions asked at scale become accusations. True crime culture often encourages this behavior subtly. Episodes end with unresolved questions. "What do you think happened?" creators ask. "Let me know your theories in the comments." Engagement is framed as participation. Participation becomes investigation. Investigation becomes judgment. At no point does anyone officially cross a line. And yet, the line is crossed repeatedly. Internet sleuths and unintended harm. When curiosity turns into consequence. The line between observer and participant has never been thinner. In the age of true crime, audiences are no longer just listening, they are investigating. Timelines are reconstructed in comment sections. Screenshots are analyzed frame by frame. Names are searched, shared, and sometimes accused. What once belonged to detectives and journalists has become a collective activity, fueled by curiosity and enabled by technology. At first, this feels empowering. The internet promises access. Anyone can research. Anyone can connect dots. Anyone can help. And in rare cases, this participation has led to real breakthroughs. Tips that reopened cases, identifications that brought long-awaited answers, pressure that forced institutions to respond. These successes are often cited as proof that crowdsourcing justice works. But they are the exception, not the rule. For every moment where collective attention helps, there are countless moments where it harms, quietly, irreversibly. And the harm rarely trends. Internet sleuthing thrives on momentum. One theory gains traction. Someone shares a suspicion. Another person adds context. Soon, speculation hardens into belief. Screenshots circulate. A name appears. And once a name is out there, it can never fully be pulled back. This is the danger of mass participation without accountability. Most internet sleuths are not malicious. They are curious, concerned, sometimes genuinely desperate to help. But good intentions do not prevent damage. In fact, they can make it worse. When people believe they are acting in the name of justice, they feel justified in crossing boundaries they would otherwise respect. Privacy becomes negotiable. Assumptions become evidence. Accusations become commentary. The internet does not wait for confirmation. It rewards speed. Algorithms and amplification. When technology decides what we should care about. In the digital age, attention is a currency, and algorithms are the mint. They determine what surfaces on your feed, what trends in search, what becomes viral. They do not ask whether a story is ethical, respectful, or accurate. They measure engagement. Clicks, watch time, likes, shares, comments. Each of these metrics is neutral in isolation, but together they shape culture, perception, and even morality. In the realm of true crime, algorithms have become invisible collaborators in storytelling, silent editors whose decisions have profound ethical consequences. Imagine a case that occurs in a small town. A disappearance is reported. A podcast covers it, presenting facts carefully. Then someone edits a video for YouTube, using suspenseful music, dramatic cuts, and a thumbnail that emphasizes danger. Another influencer reacts, speculating on motives. A news aggregator links the story. The algorithm notices engagement. It boosts these videos to new audiences, favoring content that provokes strong emotional reactions over factual nuance. Soon, millions are watching, discussing, commenting, and sharing. The algorithm, invisible and impartial, has determined what is worthy of attention. The consequences are subtle but profound. Algorithms prioritize the content that performs, not the content that is accurate, ethical, or sensitive. In true crime, that often means stories with shocking or disturbing elements, unresolved mysteries, or high emotional stakes. Videos emphasizing gruesome details, unanswered questions, or compelling suspects are amplified. Those that focus on context, victim dignity, or careful analysis languish in obscurity. The incentive structure is clear. Creators who seek engagement unconsciously adjust their content to fit the algorithm's preference. Long-form storytelling becomes a race to maintain tension. Background music swells in moments of suspense. Text flashes on screen to highlight danger. Narratives are framed around villains, suspects, and conflict rather than victims, context, or systemic issues. The result is a feedback loop. Algorithms reward sensationalism, creators produce it, audiences click on it, and the algorithm pushes it further. Algorithms do not care about ethics. But they do shape human behavior. Consider how virality alters audience perception. The more a story is shared, the more credible it appears. Even unverified claims gain weight simply through repetition and visibility. Speculation becomes fact in the minds of viewers. The algorithm amplifies the emotional impact without clarifying the ethical stakes. Millions of people encounter content designed to maximize reaction, not understanding. This amplification also obscures responsibility. No individual intended harm. Yet the outcome is the same: personal lives become public spectacle, misinformation spreads, and families endure renewed trauma. Algorithms create a system where harm is a byproduct of optimization, not malice. And because the system is invisible, it is difficult for audiences or creators to fully comprehend the scope of its influence. The amplification effect is intensified by recommendation engines. Once a user engages with true crime content, clicking a video, liking a comment, watching a full episode, the algorithm predicts their interest and feeds them more. Over time, a single story snowballs into a continuous feed of similar content. Exposure increases familiarity. Familiarity breeds comfort. Comfort can dull empathy. As viewers binge case after case, tragedy risks becoming routine. Algorithms also favor narrative clarity over nuance. Content that offers tidy conclusions, dramatic arcs, and definitive villains is prioritized. Stories without resolution, those involving marginalized victims, or those emphasizing systemic issues tend to underperform. As a result, the very cases that challenge stereotypes, question authority, or highlight injustice are less visible. The algorithm, designed to optimize for engagement, inadvertently shapes cultural memory, amplifying some stories while silencing others. The effect extends beyond individual consumption. Social media feeds and search results collectively reinforce cultural narratives. Certain crimes, victims, and perpetrators dominate public consciousness. Others vanish from view. Algorithms do not choose based on morality, they choose based on engagement, but the social and ethical consequences are real. Digital amplification determines which tragedies are mourned publicly and which are forgotten. One example is the phenomenon of viral cases. Some disappearances, murders, or scandals become cultural touchstones. They are dissected across platforms, remixed into commentary videos, discussed in forums, and analyzed in podcasts. Others, often equally tragic but less visually or emotionally dramatic, receive little attention. The disparity is rarely due to the significance of the event or the harm experienced. It is determined by algorithmic preference, shaped by audience behavior, and reinforced by platform design. The ethical gray becomes more apparent when monetization intersects with amplification. True crime content is lucrative precisely because algorithms can turn tragedy into an endlessly consumable feed. Creators who understand platform mechanics can predict which stories will perform. They can optimize thumbnails, titles, and pacing to maximize clicks. The audience, algorithmically guided, rewards these choices with watch time and engagement. And the system quietly profits from content that exists because it is emotionally compelling, not necessarily because it is morally justified. Yet, algorithms do not operate in a vacuum. They respond to human behavior. The problem is not the technology itself, it is the combination of human curiosity, desire for engagement, and structural incentives. Algorithms amplify existing tendencies, fascination with mystery, attraction to drama, and the human instinct to analyze, speculate, and theorize. In doing so, they magnify both the benefits and the harms of true crime consumption. The consequences extend beyond media ethics. Amplification affects justice and social perception. Misinformation can influence public opinion, sway jury sentiment, and shape narratives around innocence and guilt. Families of victims may face harassment or renewed trauma as their stories are circulated and dissected without consent. Perpetrators, in some cases, gain notoriety that outlasts legal consequences, their actions immortalized in content optimized for emotional engagement. Algorithms also shape memory. Cases that trend widely become cultural reference points. Others, equally serious, fade into obscurity. This selective amplification affects which crimes are remembered, which victims are mourned, and which societal issues are considered pressing. The algorithm decides, implicitly and invisibly, what society pays attention to. The ethical dilemma is compounded by invisibility. Platforms and creators often frame virality as neutral, as a natural byproduct of engagement. Viewers believe they are choosing freely what to watch, unaware that every recommendation is filtered, prioritized, and curated by systems designed to maximize attention. Choice exists, but within constraints imposed by algorithmic logic. Transparency alone is not enough. Even if viewers understand that algorithms reward sensationalism, human psychology amplifies engagement further. Emotion drives clicks. Fear, curiosity, and outrage motivate sharing. Algorithms respond. The feedback loop continues. The question becomes urgent. How do we consume responsibly when technology is optimized to make us pay attention? How do we preserve empathy when every view, every click, every like is used to measure engagement? How do we protect victims when algorithms reward stories that highlight shock over humanity? The truth is, the system encourages complicity. Passive consumption, the casual click, the binge, the recommendation-based feed, is participation. Algorithms guide behavior subtly, shaping desires, expectations, and engagement without overt coercion. And because these decisions feel voluntary, we rarely question them. Yet the consequences are undeniable. The more we feed content into the machine, the more it surfaces similar stories. The more it surfaces, the more creators optimize for it. The more creators optimize for it, the more viewers engage. And at the center of this cycle are real lives, victims, families, communities, whose suffering has been transformed into data points, metrics, and content streams. Algorithms do not kill, steal, or manipulate consciously. But they do shape human behavior in ways that amplify harm. They reward stories that entertain, provoke, and shock. They normalize speculation. They privilege narratives with clear villains and suspenseful arcs. They marginalize complexity, nuance, and quiet suffering. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for ethical consumption. Awareness of algorithmic influence forces a difficult reckoning. We are not neutral observers. Our attention has power. Our engagement fuels the system. Every click, share, and comment contributes to amplification. At the same time, algorithms are not immutable. They are products of design, shaped by human priorities, incentives, and choices. Platforms could prioritize context, sensitivity, and accuracy over engagement. They could amplify responsible storytelling. But such changes threaten profit and attention metrics. The tension between ethics and optimization is structural, not accidental. For viewers, creators, and platforms alike, the ethical gray of algorithmic amplification is unavoidable. Consumption, creation, and distribution exist within a system designed to optimize attention. Ethics compete with engagement. Humanity competes with virality. Compassion competes with performance. And in the middle, real people, the victims and their families, often have the least control. The ethical question is clear, even if uncomfortable. How do we reconcile human curiosity, technological design, and moral responsibility? How do we honor the lives of those affected when the system rewards stories that distort, sensationalize, or exploit? How do we engage with true crime content without becoming participants in harm? Algorithms do not dictate morality, but they shape opportunity. They amplify fascination. They reward spectacle. They make the ethical gray unavoidable. And unless we recognize the machinery behind the stories, we risk confusing engagement with empathy, attention with understanding, and spectacle with justice. Emotional desensitization and audience psychology. When consumption becomes complicity. There is a strange paradox in consuming true crime. The more you watch, the less you feel. Not entirely, not immediately, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, a dulling occurs. You scroll through story after story, case after case, each more harrowing than the last, and eventually, emotional reactions start to normalize. Shock becomes expected. Horror becomes background noise. Tragedy becomes a pattern rather than an anomaly. This phenomenon is not accidental. It is deeply psychological, shaped by repetition, media framing, and the very mechanics of attention. Human brains are designed to respond to novelty. Emotion rises with the unexpected, with the unfamiliar. But repetition reduces intensity. When every thumbnail promises murder, betrayal, or unspeakable violence, the first exposure triggers alarm, but the 10th, the 20th, barely registers. What was shocking becomes routine. What was tragic becomes content. Desensitization has consequences, both subtle and profound. It alters perception of risk, empathy, and morality. In extreme cases, audiences begin to engage with true crime not to understand, but to be entertained. They debate motives as if discussing a fictional plot, argue over timelines as if speculating in a game, and critique victims' actions as if evaluating a character's decisions in a novel. The human cost, the grief, trauma, and loss, is background noise in a feedback loop optimized for engagement. This is compounded by what psychologists call compassion fatigue. Our capacity for empathy is not infinite. Repeated exposure to suffering, especially in media, can lead to exhaustion. True crime delivers suffering in concentrated doses, stories condensed into hour-long episodes or 10-minute videos, each highlighting extreme violence or psychological manipulation. Audiences absorb this trauma repeatedly, often in binge sessions. Gradually, emotional resonance diminishes, leaving attention and curiosity to take its place. The effect is subtle but cumulative. People may not realize that the empathy they once felt is being redirected. Attention is given to analysis rather than understanding. Curiosity replaces compassion. The perpetrator's psychology is dissected in meticulous detail, while the victim's life is reduced to a set of circumstances that led to their death. In this way, repeated consumption creates a moral inversion. Fascination with evil grows, while empathy for suffering diminishes. Desensitization also influences behavior outside the screen. Studies have shown that repeated exposure to violence can alter perceptions of social norms, risk, and justice. Viewers may overestimate the prevalence of certain crimes, misjudge danger in real life, or develop skewed assumptions about people who are victims or perpetrators. True crime becomes not just the lens through which we view cases, it subtly reshapes our understanding of human behavior itself. Social reinforcement amplifies these effects. Online communities dedicated to true crime encourage detailed discussion, speculation, and theorizing. Forums, comment sections, and social media groups normalize intense engagement with violence. Within these spaces, critical distance erodes. Members compete to be the most insightful, the most analytical, the fastest to identify patterns. Emotional engagement is replaced by intellectualized fascination. Creators, knowingly or unknowingly, facilitate this process. They design content to maximize attention, engagement, and emotional peaks. Thumbnails highlight horror. Narration emphasizes suspense. Music cues amplify tension. Visuals linger on the crime rather than the person affected. All of these techniques work on the audience's psychology to keep attention fixed, reward curiosity, and encourage repeat engagement. Desensitization becomes an unspoken side effect. Perhaps the most troubling aspect is moral displacement. Audiences begin to feel involved in the case, invested in outcomes, and yet emotionally detached from human suffering. They debate motives and assign blame, often with a sense of authority derived from repeated exposure, without ever considering that the individuals at the center of these stories are real people with families, histories, and grief that cannot be paused for consumption. There is also the issue of normalization. When true crime is presented as entertainment, extreme acts become culturally digestible. Violence is aestheticized, trauma is packaged as narrative, and horror becomes predictable. New viewers are introduced into an environment where moral outrage is a performance, empathy is optional, and curiosity is rewarded. Over time, the collective understanding of what is acceptable to observe, and even to discuss, shifts. Desensitization interacts with parasocial dynamics in ways that complicate responsibility. Audiences may feel a sense of connection with perpetrators or creators, and yet remain disengaged from victims. The perpetrator's story becomes intimate, analyzable, and repeatable. The victim's story is finite, irretrievable, and ultimately less compelling as content. Psychological engagement becomes skewed. We care about some people intensely and others hardly at all, not because of intrinsic worth, but because of narrative accessibility and repetition. The ethical implications are significant. By the time a person has consumed hundreds of episodes, their internal moral compass has been subtly adjusted. Empathy for victims is no longer automatic. Outrage is calibrated by entertainment value. Interest in justice competes with interest in narrative twists. This creates a morally ambiguous space where consumption itself, without malice or intent, can perpetuate harm. Another dimension of desensitization is the way it shapes discussion. Audiences often debate cases with rigorous analysis, pinpointing errors in timelines or interpreting motive with precision, but rarely pause to consider the suffering that underlies the facts. Even well-meaning dialogue can become detached, procedural, or competitive, emphasizing intellect over humanity. True crime fandom begins to reward cleverness, not compassion. Compounding this effect is the global reach of digital platforms. Individuals from across the world encounter tragedies they could never have personally experienced. Cultural distance amplifies detachment. Viewers may treat cases as puzzles or entertainment without ever appreciating the personal and social ramifications. This is not indifference, it is a byproduct of the medium itself. True crime allows for curiosity without consequence, attention without empathy, and engagement without accountability. Desensitization is not permanent, nor universal. Some viewers maintain deep empathy, reflect critically, and advocate for victims. Others oscillate between fascination and emotional response. But the risk is structural. The system, as designed, encourages consumption that prioritizes engagement over moral reflection. The more one participates, the more the psychology adapts to the medium, reinforcing cycles of attention and emotional distancing. True crime's seductive power lies in its ability to make the human capacity for empathy feel optional. Audiences can observe, analyze, theorize, and debate, all without confronting the visceral reality of loss. The genre transforms natural curiosity about human behavior into a kind of moral rehearsal. We learn to react, speculate, and judge, but not necessarily to care. By the time an audience member has consumed content at scale, they may have developed a highly tuned analytical lens for crime and psychology, yet an emotional lens that is dulled. Ethical engagement becomes selective. We care about who we can relate to, understand, or debate, but struggle to feel for those who exist outside our cognitive frameworks. The moral gray is no longer just a feature of the stories, it has become a feature of the audience's experience itself. This raises an unavoidable question: can one consume true crime ethically in a system designed to erode empathy? Can fascination coexist with compassion when repeated exposure reshapes perception and dulls response? The psychological evidence suggests that awareness is necessary but insufficient. Structural, systemic, and personal responsibility must coexist to counteract desensitization. The challenge for creators, platforms, and audiences is monumental. Stories must be told in ways that engage and retain attention, yet preserve empathy and respect. Algorithms and monetization push in one direction, ethics and humanity pull in another. Audiences must be conscious participants, aware that repeated consumption changes how they think, feel, and perceive. Without reflection, the cycle of desensitization continues, perpetuating harm, normalizing violence, and distorting moral intuition. Desensitization is the silent collaborator in the ethical gray of true crime. It doesn't make creators or audiences malicious, but it makes them complicit. Every view, comment, or share is not morally neutral. It trains perception, shapes attention, and contributes to a system that rewards curiosity while dulling empathy. The danger lies not in a single episode, but in cumulative exposure. Responsibility, reflection, and the ethical gray. Can true crime ever be consumed or created ethically? After exploring the rise of true crime, the monetization of tragedy, parasocial attachments to perpetrators, internet sleuthing, algorithmic amplification, and emotional desensitization, we arrive at the most uncomfortable question: what responsibility do creators, platforms, and audiences actually bear in this ecosystem? True crime exists in a gray zone, a genre that educates, warns, and fascinates, but simultaneously profits from suffering and shapes perception in ways that can harm real people. If every part of this ecosystem contributes to the moral ambiguity, then navigating it responsibly becomes both complex and urgent. Creators, first and foremost, carry the weight of intention and execution. Many enter the space out of curiosity, empathy, or a desire to illuminate injustice. They research meticulously, present stories compellingly, and strive to honor victims while dissecting motives. But as we've seen, the pressures of monetization and engagement subtly reshape priorities. Stories are chosen not solely for their importance, but for their viral potential. Dramatic framing becomes default. Emotional peaks are engineered. Suspense is emphasized. And over time, tragedy becomes a renewable resource, sometimes at the expense of ethical reflection. Responsibility for creators is therefore both internal and external. Internal, being aware of the power their narrative choices hold, and making conscious decisions about what is highlighted, omitted, or sensationalized. External, considering the audience impact, the visibility of families, and the social consequences of speculation. A creator can decide, for instance, whether to name individuals, to include sensitive details, or to foreground victim humanity over perpetrator intrigue. Each choice signals what the creator values, and sets ethical boundaries for the audience. Some creators are actively experimenting with solutions. Transparency disclaimers, victim-focused storytelling, donations to support survivors, and advisory input from mental health professionals are ways to mitigate harm. Yet these measures remain inconsistent across the platform. When a video about a murder gets millions of views, no single creator's ethics can fully neutralize the broader systemic pressures, algorithmic amplification, audience expectations, and financial incentives, pushing in the opposite direction. Platforms themselves share responsibility. Algorithms are not morally neutral, even if they operate without intent. By amplifying content that provokes reaction, emotional engagement, or speculation, platforms reward content that often exploits suffering. Thumbnails emphasizing fear, titles highlighting gore, or autoplay functions that feed successive tragedies are not inherently unethical, but they structurally encourage creators to produce content that maximizes attention rather than empathy. Transparency about these mechanisms is limited, and options for moderation or ethical prioritization remain underdeveloped. Audiences, too, cannot be absolved. Each view, like, comment, or share contributes to the system's feedback loop. Curiosity may feel passive, but collectively it drives demand, amplifies exposure, and shapes cultural memory. Audiences reinforce what content succeeds, influencing not just creators' choices, but which cases dominate public attention. We click because we are fascinated, but in doing so, we participate in the same ecosystem that monetizes pain and normalizes trauma. Ethical consumption is therefore active, not passive. It requires reflection, restraint, and an awareness of real-world impact. One crucial tool in navigating this gray is contextual framing. True crime can be presented responsibly when creators provide not just narrative, but reflection, explaining systemic factors, acknowledging uncertainty, centering victims' lives, and highlighting broader societal implications. Instead of presenting crime as spectacle, they can contextualize it as a lens to understand human behavior, social injustice, or institutional failure. This approach respects both the story and its real-world consequences, reducing the risk of exploitation while preserving engagement. Another principle is temporal awareness. Stories unfold over years, sometimes decades, and rushing coverage for virality often ignores the reality of grief and justice. Ethical creators give space, delaying coverage, avoiding speculation, and prioritizing accuracy over speed. In doing so, they accept that engagement may be lower in the short term, but the ethical integrity of their work, and its respect for human dignity, is preserved. Transparency is equally vital. Audiences deserve clarity about the limits of speculation, the sources of information, and the ethical choices made during production. When creators disclose what is verified, what is conjecture, and what is intentionally omitted, they allow viewers to engage critically rather than passively absorb potentially harmful narratives. This openness builds trust and encourages responsible interaction. But even with conscientious creators and transparent platforms, the gray persists. Algorithms will still favor engagement. Audiences will still seek the shocking, the suspenseful, the morbidly fascinating. True crime's appeal is partly rooted in the human instinct to probe danger and morality. We are naturally drawn to the stories of transgression, survival, and mortality. That curiosity is not inherently unethical, but it requires constant reflection to avoid complicity in harm. This reflection also applies to the psychological impact of repeated consumption. Audiences must consider emotional desensitization, parasocial attachment, and the way fascination with perpetrators can overshadow empathy for victims. Critical media literacy becomes essential, understanding the mechanics of narrative, the influence of algorithms, and the subtle ways repeated exposure changes perception. Consumption is not ethically neutral, it is an active choice with consequences, both personal and societal. Legal systems and policy can play a role as well. Regulations on the dissemination of sensitive material, the rights of victims and families, and accountability for misinformation can mitigate harm. But legislation alone cannot resolve the ethical gray. Culture, psychology, and platform incentives also drive behavior. Responsibility is distributed across creators, audiences, platforms, and institutions alike. Each actor must navigate tension between engagement, curiosity, and care. Despite the challenges, ethical engagement with true crime is possible. It requires acknowledging the gray, not avoiding it. It requires prioritizing humanity over virality, accuracy over speculation, and empathy over fascination. It requires creators to resist the allure of attention at the expense of dignity, platforms to consider amplification as a moral act, and audiences to consume with reflection rather than reflex. Ultimately, the ethical gray is not a problem to solve, it is a landscape to navigate. True crime can inform, warn, and illuminate. It can teach lessons about society, justice, and human behavior. It can spark empathy, critical thinking, and advocacy. But only when every actor in the ecosystem, creator, platform, and viewer alike, recognizes the stakes, reflects on their role, and accepts the responsibility that comes with attention. The stories themselves are timeless. They will continue to unfold, to fascinate, and to disturb. But how we interact with them defines whether we are complicit in harm or participants in understanding. True crime does not have to exist as exploitation. It can exist as exploration. It can exist as reflection. It can exist as a mirror, showing the darkest corners of human behavior while challenging us to respond with care, compassion, and responsibility. In the end, the question is not simply whether true crime is ethical. It is whether we, as creators, platforms, and audiences, choose to make it so. Will we engage passively, feeding the machinery of spectacle and desensitization? Or will we navigate the gray thoughtfully, balancing curiosity with empathy, fascination with humanity, and engagement with morality? The ethical gray is unavoidable. But how we act within it defines the difference between consumption that harms and consumption that honors. Between storytelling that exploits and storytelling that enlightens. Between curiosity that alienates and curiosity that illuminates. And perhaps, that is the most important lesson of all. In true crime, as in life, attention is not neutral. It carries power, responsibility, and consequence. How we wield it determines not just the story we consume, but the world we participate in shaping.